This week, we're talking about the federal government shutdown and what impact it might have on various aspects of public policy. And to help us navigate this issue, I'm excited to welcome into the virtual studio Matt Weidinger. He's a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a kind of a veteran of the U.S. Capitol Hill environment, worked for Ways and Means Committee, was there for close to 3 decades. And Matt, also a veteran of government shutdowns, you might say. So Matt, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Glad to be with you, Nick.
We're really excited to talk to you about this because I think this is one of those issues that maybe in longer trajectories, if you look at history of governance over decades, but certainly in recent years, it seems to be a more common thing that at times folks in Congress just can't get together when it comes to passing what they need to keep the government funded and functioning. And we found ourselves again in the middle of a federal government shutdown. And maybe I want to ask you first I want to help our audience understand in more detail what is driving this latest shutdown. And obviously, if there's any context you want to offer about putting this shutdown in context of sort of broader examples in the past, we'll get into that as well. But maybe to start off, Matt, what is actually going on? You know, we see the news headlines and we see people popping off on social media, but from your perspective, what do we need to understand about this shutdown?
So, maybe the first thing to do is sort of talk a little bit about what a shutdown means, right? So federal government has certain types of programs that always happen. They're sort of mandatory, often referred to as entitlements, and kind of without regard to the individual passage of laws involving what are called discretionary programs in any given year. Those programs always happen. So think Social Security, Medicare benefits, that sort of thing. Discretionary programs are not that. They are things that require the federal government every year. Congress has to look at these programs and say, well, we're going to choose the right amount of funding for these, or in some cases, maybe it's not going to be any funding at all. Like I said, those are called discretionary programs. And usually Congress needs to pass by the end of the fiscal year, which in Washington is September 30th, what's called an appropriations bills for that. And there are about a dozen appropriations bills for all the various things the federal government does. And when that doesn't happen, when those appropriations bills are not passed by the end of the fiscal year, something else has to happen. Either Congress passes what's normally called a continuing resolution, which is a numbingly boring term in the way that Washington does these things, that sort of kicks the can down the road and says, of these discretionary things that the federal government does and pays for, we're going to keep doing those for some period of time. Or if it doesn't do that, the government is shut down. Those discretionary activities come to a halt. And that's where we find ourselves right now. The sort of simple math in DC is Republicans control the House, Republicans control the Senate, but that's not enough to overcome this sort of math behind a shutdown. The House has passed a bill, a continuing resolution in September, that kicked the funding can down the road to the middle of November. The Senate, which has 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats, has voted on that a dozen times, but because Senate rules require 60 members to approve most legislation like that, it hasn't been passed. And the basic dynamic is you have all Republicans and a very small handful of Democrats, not the 7 that it takes to get from 53 Republicans to 60 overall, that are supporting that CR so far. And so, that's the kind of basic dynamics of what's at work here. And we can talk about, what all that means and the, implications for individual programs and real human beings and all that. But that's the kind of nuts and bolts inside DC of what's going on with the shutdown right now.
Matt, that's incredibly helpful, actually. It's a very concise explanation for folks who might just be catching snippets of this in the news. I want to ask kind of another general question, sort of channeling what I can only assume is widespread frustration or annoyance with the federal government at the fact that these things happen. And for context for that, in a previous role a number of years ago, I was a senior policy advisor for a member of the Salt Lake County Council. And in our role working for the Salt Lake County Council, There were a number of things that we did, but arguably the most important of which was every fall going through the budget process and evaluating all the requests and past expenditures and passing a budget for the county to continue to function. And again, I would argue it's the most important thing we did because that's an incredibly important aspect of the legislative branch to, one, be a check on the executive, and two, obviously appropriate dollars to where they need to go. And at the state level, I've worked closely with the state legislature in various different capacities, and same kind of thing. At the end of the legislative session, passing a state budget is kind of the most important thing the legislature does in many respects. So it is a little bit frustrating or annoying to sort of have come from that background and say, we fought about a lot of things, but at the end of the day, we always passed a budget. Why does it seem so hard for Congress to, at the very least, just pass a budget?
I mean, that's an excellent question. And really, these sorts of shutdowns, I would argue, are sort of a symptom of a broader dysfunction. Like you said, one of the basic operations of government is to pass a budget, right? Pass a plan and pass the funding to implement that plan. Well, taking a step back, where do we find ourselves with Washington nowadays? In good times, we're running deficits of $2 trillion, right? That includes $1 trillion now in interest on all of the accumulated deficits from the past. So taxpayers today are literally making good on the sort of the benefit promises that have been made in the past that were not fully funded with revenues. So you have this like usual kind of red versus blue, Republicans versus Democrat, conservative, liberal argument about like what's the proper size of government. And the shutdown is really indicative of that coming to a head and policymakers not being willing to meet each other halfway. Like I said, in the Senate, especially with current numbers, it takes a little bit of bipartisanship, not a lot of bipartisanship, but a little bit of bipartisanship to overcome things like a shutdown. But, here we have this sort of, ongoing debate now in day, where are we, 27, where members cannot find agreement. And there's, all sorts of political dynamics behind this that go to life in the Trump era, but even more the nature of where the parties are today. I mean, some of this, I can make a pretty coherent argument that a lot of this is really reflective of the leftward tilt of the Democrat Party, because you have, as I've written, we can talk about this in a little bit, you have basically the liberal Democrat base that is resisting some of their more moderate members agreeing with Republicans to reopen the government right now. And that's a unique and new dynamic, where in the past, often the sort of the conditions behind the shutdown, the reason why the shutdown came into being was because Republicans wanted to sort of force a policy rider to be added onto this, legislation that keeps the government up and running. We're in a totally different landscape now when it comes to that.
Can I ask you about that a little bit more, Matt? Because in my mind, one, I would say it's easy, I think, for some to look at this shutdown and say either it's just partisan politics run amok yet again, or there is a lot of messaging, which I want to talk about in the next segment, the messaging around specifically the Affordable Care Act tax credit extension debate that seems to be a sticking point. So I want to get into that in a minute. But first, on the political end, I guess the question would be, to what extent do you attribute this latest shutdown to it's just politics as usual yet again versus significant policy concerns? And maybe I'll mention, for context for our audience, you wrote a piece recently for the AEI Ideas blog called "Democrats Fear Their Liberal Base If They Vote to Reopen the Government." We'll include that link in the show notes so folks can go read it. But can you talk about that a little bit? To what extent are these kind of interesting political dynamics you're talking about sort of either causing this or furthering it?
I think the political dynamics are a significant part of what's going on here. And it's not something that you see reflected in your standard, oh, Republicans versus Democrats having the usual fights in Washington. Like I said, I think a significant part here is sort of a intramural squabble amongst Democrats. So you don't have to have too long of a memory to remember how we were sort of facing a partial shutdown earlier in the year because the continuing resolution from last year into this year was coming due in March. And the same sort of dynamics applied. We needed to have a certain number of Democrats to agree with mostly Republicans to keep the government up and running. through roughly the end of March. And there was a drama within the Democrat Party about whether they were going to provide those votes. And the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer from New York, in the end, sort of, I think cave is probably the term that you would see in the political articles about this, agreed to let a certain number of Democrats side with Republicans to keep the government from shutting down in March. He took a ton of heat from his liberal base for that. And I think you're seeing that play out. Chuck Schumer also happens to be up for re-election next fall. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a very famous House member from his same state. I don't know if she's thrown her hat in the ring, but she's widely believed to be in the running to compete with him for the Democrat nomination for that Senate seat. Chuck Schumer, like all politicians, doesn't want to lose. So he's smart enough to recognize if he got himself in a lot of trouble in the spring for doing exactly what is expected now for some number of Democrats to be allowed to agree with Republicans to open the government up. And he certainly is smart enough to look at the polls that see 2/3 of Democrats amazingly support the shutdown, right? Like, this is a Democrat on Democrat issue at the moment that is sort of masquerading as just another sort of standard Republican versus Democrat issue. So, I mean, the interior dynamics of the Democrat Party are fascinating. You'd spend a lot of time, looking and talking about that. But the bottom line is, this is a significant Democrat on Democrat issue, not just your standard Republican versus Democrat issue. So that's not the only thing that's driving it, but I would say at this point that is a more than 50% part of what's going on here.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.